Hello, Crossroads family. It is good to be able to do these devotionals this format, and I'm grateful to Stephanie and Tiffany for beginning this process. It started with a conversation at a staff meeting as we talked about taking risks this time of year. And so we began to say, where do we find people in the Bible who are risk takers? And as I've listened to Stephanie's and I listened to Tiffany's and thinking through that, I've come to realize that there is a real connection between taking a risk and stepping out of faith, especially as we see it in the biblical characters found in Scripture. So I want to think about who I would consider the father of all risk takers, and that is who's often referred to as the father of our faith, and that's Abraham. Abraham lives in a region of the Middle East known as the Ur of the Chaldeans. It's a place in what was ancient Mesopotamia. And God calls him, we read about it in Genesis chapter 12, God calls him to follow him. And he says, go, leave your family, all that you know and that you're familiar with. And I want you to go to a land, a place that you do not know, and I will make of you a great nation. Genesis chapter 12 goes on to tell and promise Abraham that out of that nation, he will bless all the peoples of the world, that beginning of taking that risk will extend to generation after generation after generation. And it's pretty cool because the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 11, verse 8, he makes this statement that he had no idea where he was going. He went though he did not know where he was going. Can you imagine? That you don't have a Google Maps, you don't have a destination in mind. Start walking, Abraham, and when you get there, I'll tell you that you're there. I think one of the reasons that Abraham was willing to take that initial risk, though he did not really know this God, he was willing to take that risk because God touched a nerve in his life when he said, I will give you a family, I will give you a son, I will give you a future, a legacy. There will be a heritage. Because at this point in Abraham's life, he didn't have a child. He didn't have a son. And so he was willing to take that initial risk because there was something that really intrigued him. Fast forward to the story and you get to Genesis chapter 17 and God says, I am going to give you and your wife Sarah a child. And you are to name him, what? Isaac, because that means laughter. And when they were told that at their older age, they were going to have a son, Sarah couldn't help herself and she laughed. And when the baby is born, Abraham is 100 years old. Sarah is 90. Can you imagine that? Not the time of life to have a baby. And they name him Isaac. And every time they call Isaac in for dinner or for any activity, they have to say to themselves, ah, yes, laughter, laughter. God was faithful to his promises in all of this. And what we see is, I would end the story right there. Abraham and Sarah have their baby boy, the promise is fulfilled, and they lived happily ever after. But that isn't where the story ends. As a matter of fact, if you go forward to Genesis chapter 21, what we read there at the end of that in verses 23 and 24, or 30, I think it's 33 and 34, is that it says Abraham planted a tamarisk tree. That's biblical code for he planted a tree that was going to provide great shade. And he was going to set up his chair, maybe his hammock, find himself a nice lemonade and chill. He was going to retire because everything had come to fruition, that risk that he had taken. And then yet, as you read Genesis chapter 22, God says, take your son, your one and only son, Isaac, and offer him as a sacrifice to me. This was the challenge now of whether he would take that next step of faith, that next risk, that challenge of the very thing that you've put all your energy, that which become the fulfillment of your dreams. God says, I want to make sure that I'm simply not a means to an end. This was never about Isaac. This was about trusting me and taking a risk. And oftentimes when we take that first step of faith, that first risk, if you will, it prepares us for the next level where God challenges us to the greater degree to step out in faith in an area that we think is almost impossible. And God shows up and he's faithful to his promises. So just a couple of thoughts as we wrap up. Risk steps, I understand, are faith steps, but they're never done. They're never completed. God always wants all of us, every time he calls us to take a risk or to step out in faith. And we learn to trust him in every season of life. Sometimes they're different seasons of life. Sometimes they're different situations of life. But we learn to take those risks, those steps of faith. Sometimes they're easy to take some of those risks because we basically have nothing to lose. Abraham might have thought, okay, I'll leave my homeland because I'm going to see what happens here. And there's not a lot. Yeah, I'm leaving my family behind, but it seems like a greater future. But when it comes to Genesis 22, sometimes taking a risk costs us everything. But that's where God demonstrates to us, as he did to Abraham, now you understand that I will be with you always, that I will provide for you and meet your needs in all these things. This happens to be the best picture of what we see of what Jesus Christ did on our behalf, that we're told that God truly also offered his one and only son on our behalf. God took that risk, if you will, for us, that he gave his one and only son to die for us, that we might have that relationship with him, that we might be united, that we might be able to see him do a deeper, powerful work. Thanks, you guys. Good talking to you.